Section number 134 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The World Story, Volume 1. China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 134. The Vengeance of the Goddess Pele, a Hawaiian legend related by Kalakaua, formerly king of the Hawaiian Islands. Pele was the goddess who dwelt in the awful fires of the volcano Kilauea. She was so easily offended and so terrible in her anger that the people who lived in volcanic districts built temples in her honor and sacrificed fruit, animals, and sometimes human beings, in order to win her favor or to free themselves from the fearful consequences of her wrath. The Editor. The grass thatched mansion of the young chief Kahavari was near Kapuhu, where his wife lived, with their two children, Pampuu and Kahui, and at Kukii, no great distance away, dwelt his old mother, then on a visit to her distinguished son. As his taro lands were large and fertile, and he had fish ponds on the sea shore, he entertained with prodigality, and the people of Puna thought there was no chief like him in all Hawaii. It was at the time of the monthly festival of Lono. The day was beautiful. The trade winds were bending the leaves of the palms, and scattering the spray from the breakers chasing each other over the reef. A honua contest had been announced between the stalwart young chief and his favorite friend and companion Ahua, and a large concourse of men, women, and children had assembled at the foot of the hill to witness the exciting pastime. They brought with them drums, ohus, ulilis, rattling gourds, and other musical instruments, and while they awaited the coming of the contestants, all frolicked as if they were children, frolicked as were their way before the white man came to tell them they were nearly naked, and that life was too serious a thing to be frittered away in enjoyment. They ate ohais, coconuts, and bananas under the palms, and chewed the pith of sugar cane. They danced, sang, and laughed at the hula and other sports of the children, and grew nervous with enthusiasm when their bards chanted the meles of gone years. The game of hola consists in sliding down a sometimes long but always steep hill on a narrow sledge from 6 to 12 feet in length, called a papa. The light and polished runners, bent upward at the front, are bound quite closely together, with crossbars for the hands and feet. With a run at the top of the sliding track, slightly smoothed and sometimes strewn with rushes, the rider throws himself face downward on the narrow papa and dashes headlong down the hill. As the sledge is no more than 6 or 8 inches in width, with more than as many feet in length, one of the principal difficulties of the descent is in keeping it under the rider. The other, of course, is in guiding it, but long practice is required to master the subtleties of either. Kahavari was an adept with the papa, and so was Ahua. Rare sport was therefore expected, and the people of the neighborhood assembled almost in a body to witness it. Finally appearing at the foot of the hill, Kahavari and his companions were heartily cheered by their good natured auditors. Their papas were carried by attendants. The chief smiled upon the assemblage, and as he struck his tall spear into the ground and divested his broad shoulders of the kihei covering them, the wagers of fruit and pigs were 3-1 that he would reach the bottom first, although Ahua was expert with the papa, and but a month before had beaten the champion of Kau on his own ground. Taking their sledges under their arms, the contestants laughingly mounted the hill with firm, strong strides, neither thinking of resting till the top was gained. Stopping for a moment preparatory to the descent, a comely looking woman stepped out from behind a clump of undergrowth and bowed before them. Little attention was paid to her until she approached still nearer and boldly challenged Kahavari to contest the hula with her instead of Ahua. Exchanging a smile of amusement with his companion, the chief scanned the lithe and shapely figure of the woman for a moment, and then exclaimed, more in astonishment than in anger, "What! With a woman? And why not with a woman, if she is your superior and you lack not the courage?" was the calm rejoinder. "You are bold, woman," returned the chief, with something of a frown. "What know you of the papa?" "Enough to reach the bottom of the hill in front of the chief of Puna," was the prompt and defiant answer. "Is it so, indeed? Then take the papa and we will see," said Kahavari, with an angry look which did not seem to disturb the woman in the least. At a motion from the chief, Ahua handed his papa to the woman, and the next moment Kahavari, with the strange contestants closely behind him, was dashing down the hill. On they went, around and over rocks, at breakneck speed, but for a moment the woman lost her balance, and Kahavari reached the end of the course a dozen paces in advance. Music and shouting followed the victory of the chief, and, scowling upon his exultant multitude, the woman pointed to the hill, silently challenging the victor to another trial. They mounted the hill without a word, and turned for another start. "Stop!" said the woman, while a strange light flashed in her eyes. "Your papa is better than mine. If you would act fairly, let us now exchange." "Why should I exchange?" replied the chief hastily. "You are neither my wife nor my sister, and I know you not. Come!" And presuming the woman was following him, Kahavari made a spring and dashed down the hill on his papa. With this the woman stamped her foot, and a river of burning lava burst from the hill and began to pour down into the valley beneath. Reaching the bottom, Kahavari rose and looked behind him, and to his horror saw a wide and wild torrent of lava rushing down the hillside toward the spot where he was standing, and riding on the crest of the foremost wave was the woman, now no longer disguised, but Pele, the dreadful goddess of Kilauea, with thunder at her feet and lightning playing with her flaming tresses. Seizing his spear, Kahavari, accompanied by Ahua, fled for his life to the small eminence of Puukea. He looked behind, and saw the entire assemblage of spectators engulfed in a sea of fire. With terrible rapidity the valleys began to fill, and he knew that his only hope of escape was in reaching the ocean, for it was manifest that Pele was intent upon his destruction. He fled to his house, and passing it without stopping, said farewell to his mother, wife, and children, and to his favorite hog Aliopua, telling them that Pele was in pursuit of him with a river of fire, and to save themselves if possible by escaping to the hills, he left them to their fate. Coming to a chasm, he saw Pele pouring lava down it to cut off his retreat. He crossed on his spear, pulling his friend over after him. At length, closely pursued, he reached the ocean. His brother, discovering the danger, had just landed from his fishing canoe, and had gone to look after the safety of his family. Kahavari leaped into the canoe with his companions, and using his spear for a paddle was soon beyond the reach of the pursuing lava. Enraged at his escape, Pele ran some distance into the water and hurled after him huge stones that hissed as they struck the waves, until an east wind sprang up and carried him far out to sea. He first reached the island of Maui, and thence by the way of Lanai found his way to Oahu, where he remained to the end of his days. All his relatives in Puna perished, with hundreds of others in the neighborhood of Kapoho. But he never ventured back to Puna, the grave of his hopes and his people, for he believed Pele, the unforgiving, would visit the place with another horror if he did. Pele had come down from Kilauea in a pleasant mood to witness the holua contest, but Kahavari angered her unwittingly, and what followed has just been described. End of section 134. This recording is in the public domain. Section number 135 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The World Story, Volume 1. China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 135. Father Damien, the Missionary to the Lepers, by John C. Lambert. He was born in 1840 of peasant parents at a little village on the river Lac, not far from the ancient city of Louvain in Belgium. His real name was Joseph de Veuster, Damien being a new name which he adopted, according to the custom of the religious orders, when he was admitted to the congregation of the Picpus Fathers. In 1864 he joined on the shortest notice as a substitute for his elder brother who had suddenly fallen ill. A band of missionaries for the Hawaiian Islands, and his life's labors were begun in the very island on which Captain Cook met his tragic end so long before. Here for 9 years he toiled unsparingly, endearing himself to the natives, and earning from his bishop the title of the Intrepid, because nothing ever seemed to daunt him. He had many adventures, both on the sea and among the volcanic mountains, for, like Bishop Huntington, whom he frequently recalls, he was a bold cliff climber and a strong swimmer. In visiting the people in the remoter parts of the island, he thought nothing of scaling precipitous rocks on hands and knees, till his boots were torn to shreds and the blood flowed freely from feet as well as hands. Once when his canoe capsized he had to save his life by a long swim in his clothes. On another occasion, as he was riding along a lonely coast, he observed a ship's boat with several persons in it drifting helplessly towards the rocks. Jumping from his horse, he plunged into the sea, and succeeded in reaching the boat and bringing to land 8 shipwrecked sailors, 3 Americans, 4 Englishmen, and a Dutchman. Their vessel had taken fire in mid ocean, For more than a week they had drifted about in the Pacific, till their strength was utterly exhausted, and death was already staring them in the eyes, when the brave young priest came with deliverance. But we must pass from deeds of courage and daring in which Damien had been equalled by many others, to speak of the great deed of sacrifice in which he stands alone. The lovely Hawaiian Islands have long suffered from terrible scourge, the scourge of leprosy. Some years after Father Damien's arrival, the government determined on the use of drastic measures to stamp out the evil. There is in the archipelago an island called Molokai, which along its northern side presents to the sea an awful front of a precipice. At one spot, however, in this frowning battlement of rock, and bearing to it, in R. L. Stevenson's vivid comparison, the same relation as a bracket to a wall, there projects into the ocean a rugged triangular piece of land known as Kalawao, which is thus cut off between the surf and the precipice. To this desolate tongue of windswept down it was resolved to deport every person, young or old, rich or poor, prince or commoner, in whom the slightest taint of leprosy should be found. The law was carried into effect with the utmost rigour. All over the islands, lepers and those suspected of having leprosy were hunted out by the police, dragged away from their homes, and if certified by a doctor as touched by the disease, at once shipped off to the leper settlement, as if to a state prison. Children were torn from their parents, and parents from their children. Husbands and wives were separated forever. In no case was any respect of persons shown, and a near relative of the Hawaiian queen was among the first to be seized and transported. Awful indeed was the lot of these poor creatures, thus gathered together from all parts of the islands, and shot out like rubbish on that dismal wedge of land between cliff and sea, parted for ever from their friends, outcasts of society, with no man to care for their bodies or their souls, with nothing to hope for but a horrible unpitied death. They gave themselves up to a life like that of the beasts of the field. And even to this day things might have been no better on the peninsula of Kalawao had it not been for the coming of Father Damien. For some time Damien had felt the dreadful lot of these unfortunates pressing heavily upon his heart, all the more as several of his own flock had been carried away to the settlement. In a letter written about this time he says that when he saw his own beloved people dragged away, he felt a presentiment that he should see them again. Such a presentiment could only point to one thing. From Molokai no leper was ever permitted to return. Above the beach of Kalawao, as above the arched portal of Dante's Inferno, the awful words might have stood: "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." If Father Damien was to see his poor smitten children again, it must be by going to them, for never more should they return to him. One day there was a gathering of the Roman Catholic clergy at the dedication of a church on the island of Maui, which lies not far from Molokai. After the ceremony was over, the bishop was holding a familiar conversation with his missionaries, and in the course of it he spoke of the distress he felt for the poor lepers of Molokai, stricken sheep without a shepherd. At once Damien spoke out. "My lord," he said, "on the day when I was admitted to the order of the Picpus Fathers, I was placed under the pall, that I might learn that voluntary death is the beginning of a new life. and I wish to declare now that I am ready to bury myself alive among the lepers of Molokai, some of whom are well known to me." It shows the stuff of which those Roman Catholic missionaries were made that the bishop accepted Damien's proposal as simply and readily as it was uttered. "I could not have imposed this task upon any one," he said, "but I gladly accept the offer you have made." At once Damien was ready to start, for, like General Gordon when he started for Khartoum, he required no time for preparations. A few days afterwards, on May 11, 1873, he was landed on the beach of Kalawao along with a batch of 50 miserable lepers, whom the authorities had just collected from various parts of Hawaii. The sights that met the eye of the devoted missionary must have been revolting beyond expression, though Damien says little about them, for it was not his habit to dwell on these details. Stevenson visited Molokai after Damien was dead, and after the place had been purged, bettered, beautified, by his influence and example, but he describes the experience as grinding and harrowing. The Princess Regent of Hawaii once paid a state visit to the settlement while Damien was there, and after his presence had wrought a marvelous transformation. The lepers were dressed in their best. Triumphal arches adorned the beach. Flowers were strewn in profusion along the path that led to the place of reception. But when the royal lady looked around her on that awful crowd, the tears rolled down her cheeks, and though it had been arranged that she should speak to the people, her lips trembled so helplessly that she was unable to utter a single word. Damien came to Kalawao when the settlement was at its worst. He saw it too, not as a passing visitor, but as one who knew that henceforth this was to be his only home on earth. He confesses that for a moment, as he stepped ashore, his heart sank within him, but he said to himself, "Now, Joseph, my boy, this is your life work," and never during the 16 years that followed did he go back upon his resolve. For several weeks, until he found time to build himself a hut, he had no shelter but a large pandanus tree. This pandanus tree he called his house, and under its branches he lay down on the ground to sleep at night. Meanwhile, from the very first, he spent his days in trying to teach and help and comfort his leper flock. In a letter to his brother, Father Pamphile, in substitution for whom, as mentioned already, he had become a Hawaiian missionary, he admits that at first he almost grew sick in the presence of so much physical corruption. On Sundays especially, when the people crowded closely round him in the little building which served as a chapel, he often felt as if he must rush out of the loathsome atmosphere into the open air. But he deliberately crushed these sensations down. He sought to make himself as one of the lepers, and carried this so far that in his preaching he did not use the conventional "my brethren," but employed the expression "we lepers" instead. And by the spirit of sympathy grew so strong that even in the presence of what was most disgusting, all feeling of repugnance passed entirely away. It was not only the souls of the lepers for which Father Damien cared. At the time there was no doctor in the settlement, so he set himself to soothe their bodily sufferings as best he could, cleansing their open wounds and binding up their stumps and sores. Death was constantly busy. Indeed, some one died almost every day, and whether at noon or at midnight, the good father was there to perform the last offices of his church, and as he sought to comfort the lepers in dying, his care for them continued after they were dead. Before his arrival no one had thought of burying a dead leper with any sort of decency. No coffin was provided; the corpse at best was shovelled hastily into a shallow hole. But Father Damien's reverence for a human being forbade him to acquiesce in such arrangements. As there was no one else to make coffins, he made them himself, and it is estimated that during his years on Molokai he made not less than 1,500 with his own hands. More than this, when no other could be got to dig a proper grave, Damien did not hesitate to seize his spade and act the part of the grave digger. To most people, such toils as pastor and teacher, doctor and undertaker, would seem more than enough for even the strongest of men. But they were far from summing up the labors of Damien. He induced the people to build themselves houses, and as few of them knew how to begin, he became head mason and carpenter in chief to the whole settlement. He next got them to give him their assistance in erecting suitable chapels at different points of the peninsula. He built 2 orphanages, one for boys and one for girls, into which he gathered all the fatherless and motherless children, and to the instruction of these young people he gave special attention. Above all, he sought by constant cheerfulness and unflagging energy to infuse a new spirit into that forlorn collection of doomed men and women. By teaching them to work, he brought a fresh and healthy interest into their lives. By creating a Christian public opinion, he lifted them out of the condition of filth and sottishness into which they had sunk. But above all he wiped off from their souls the soiling of despair, by assurance he gave them of human sympathy and divine love. What was Father Damien like? Many will ask. He was tall and strong, indeed an imposing presence, with a bright and serene countenance, and a rich and powerful voice. The very sight of him brought strength and comfort to others. Like the Master whom he loved and sought to follow, and who also was the friend of the leper, he was possessed of a strange magnetism, a kind of vital virtue, which, though in Damien's case it could not effect miracles, yet had power to lift up the hearts of those who were bowed down by their infirmities. So the years passed on, while day after day was filled up with such tasks as we have described. During the first 6 months the father was sometimes haunted by the thought that he had contracted the insidious disease, but thereafter he banished the idea from his mind, and lived on in Molokai for many years in perfect health and strength. One day, however, as he was washing his feet in unusually hot water, he noticed that they had been blistered with the heat without his being conscious of any pain. At once he knew what this meant. He had not lived so long in the settlement without learning that the absence of feeling in any part of the body is one of the surest symptoms of leprosy, and now he understood that his doom was sealed. But the fact made very little difference in either his thoughts or his ways. So long as he was able he went on with his duties as before, while he exerted himself with special anxiety to secure that after he was gone the work he had been doing in the settlement should be carried on, and carried on still more efficiently than had been possible for one who labored single handed. And before he died he had the joy of knowing not only that these deeds of love and mercy would be taken up and continued by other fathers of his order, but that a band of Franciscan sisters, inspired by his great example, had volunteered to serve as nurses among the lepers of Molokai, and that an adequate hospital with a thoroughly qualified doctor would seek to assuage the sufferings of those who had reached the last stages of the fatal malady. In spite of all that Father Damien accomplished when he was alive, we might almost say that he did more for the Hawaiian lepers by his death than by his life. It was not till after he had passed away that men came to a full knowledge of this hero of the 19th century. Largely by the help of the burning pen of Robert Louis Stevenson, the story of his willing martyrdom flew round the world and made the name of Molokai illustrious. International sympathy was aroused for the poor sufferers for whom Damien laid down his life. The press of every Christian country resounded with his fame. Princes and peasants sought to do him honour. His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, afterwards Edward VII, placed himself at the head of a movement which had for its object to commemorate the life and labours of this brave soldier saint of Jesus Christ. Money flowed in, by which it became possible to do much more for Damien's leper flock than he had ever been able to do himself. The Damien Institute was formed in England for the training of Roman Catholic youths to the laborious life of missionary priests in the South Seas. When Father Damien's end was drawing near, he expressed a desire to be buried at the foot of the pandanus tree beneath which he had lived when he first came to Molokai. The two fathers who were now with him thought it right to comply with his wishes, and so under the very spot which once served him for his bed, his body lies awaiting the resurrection, with flowers growing over it, and the wide tree spreading above. In one of the streets of Louvain there stands a beautiful statue of Father Damien. His face is uplifted to heaven. His left hand holds a crucifix to his heart. His right arm is thrown in love and protection round the shoulder of a poor leper, who crouches to his side for comfort. It is a fine conception, finely executed, and yet its effect upon the beholder can hardly compare with the feelings of those who, like Stevenson and other pilgrims to the island, have stood by that grave in Molokai, beneath the old pandanus tree, and seen Father Damien's monument lying all around him in that community of lepers, which has been purged, bettered, beautified by his great act of sacrifice. End of section 135. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Section 136 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Nix. The World Story, Volume 1, China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific, edited by Eva March Tappan, Section 136. A Visit to Aguinaldo by Edwin Wildman. The Philippines were visited by Magellan in 1521. Half a century later, the Spanish took possession of them and named them in honor of Philip II of Spain. In 1896, the natives, led by Aguinaldo, revolted against Spanish rule. After the Spanish-American War, Aguinaldo fought against the United States, into whose hands the islands had now fallen. In 1901, he was captured, and American rule was established throughout the Philippines. The Editor. In November 1898, I visited Aguinaldo at his capital at Malolos. I was laboring under the popular delusion as to Aguinaldo's greatness, and judged him largely from the documents that bore his name, although I was in possession of some information which aided me in understanding somewhat the situation at Malolos. I was well acquainted with a number of revolutionary sympathizers, and several members of Aguinaldo's cabinet who resided in Manila, and considering their views and the positions they held, I was somewhat surprised at the open manner in which they depreciated Aguinaldo's ability and deplored the prominence accorded him, even while they themselves admitted that his name was the only one that held the natives in check and united in the aspirations for independence. It was humiliating to them that Aguinaldo, instead of one of their number, held the confidence of the people. I shall not soon forget my pilgrimage to the Filipino Mecca. Those were the palmy days of the Republica Filipina, and Aguinaldo's name was on every lip. There was a cordon of insurgent soldiers around Manila, and to pass this line one must needs have a pass signed by Aguinaldo. I boarded the diminutive train on the Manila-Dagupan Railroad, and in company with 12 carloads of barefooted natives, was soon speeding along the little narrow gauge toward Malolos. In half an hour we had passed the cordon, and I and my Filipino companion were landed on the Malolos platform, which was patrolled by a half-dozen or more Filipino soldiers, who strutted up and down and, it seemed to me, looked upon me with suspicion. I greeted their looks with an affable smile, we all did then, and they withdrew their stare and passed on. After the little train puffed out of the station, I pushed my way through a crowd of palm-extended beggars, treading upon deformed limbs and leprous faces, and reached the opposite side of the station, where lingered beneath the shade of some scraggly palms a half-dozen carometas, attached by crude hemp harnesses to ponies, long strangers to Sakati and Pali. Though naturally merciful to the animal kingdom, I was prevailed upon by Malolos hackmen, augmented by the persuasive rays of the midday sun, to take a seat in one of their crude carts, and was soon bumping and joggling over the occasionally planked road toward the Pueblo. It was tiffin time, and I knew better than to disturb any Filipino gentleman at midday, for a siesta follows tiffin with as much regularity as a demi-tasse does dinner in America. My Filipino friend and myself therefore repaired to a public house and partook of a native meal, which was washed down by native drinks, the combination fitting one for any crime. After visiting the church, the public square, and the town pump, I presented myself at the Casa Aguinaldo. The Presidente made his headquarters in the second story of a large convent, or priest's house as it is called, adjoining the Malolos church, which was utilized to accommodate the sessions of the Filipino Congress. 2 Maxim guns protruded from the windows of the convent, and the entrance was guarded by a patrol of Filipino soldiery. We passed this gauntlet without challenge and ascended the convent stairs. At the top extended a long, broad hall. On either side of this passageway were stationed Aguinaldo's bodyguards armed with halberds. Diminutive Filipinos, almost comical in their toy-like dignity, were ranged along the wall, giving themselves an extra brace as we passed. The halberds were cheap imitations of those customarily used in the palace of the Governor-General at Manila upon state occasions. Our cards were sent in. The Presidente would receive us. Would we wait for a brief space? The dapper but brave little insurgent general, Pio del Pinar, was pleased to greet us. The Presidente knew of my coming. Had it not been telegraphed to him when we crossed the line? Ah, Senor, the Presidente knows everything. He desires to protect Americans when they do him so much honor. But did one need special protection in Aguinaldo's country? No, Senor, but there are Spaniards who yet hope and hate. Too much caution cannot be exercised. Would we look at the council room? And so on. I early learned that if one wished to get information from a Filipino, one must not ask it. Aguinaldo's council chamber was interesting. Down the center of the hall were parallel rows of chairs, Filipino style, facing each other. Here sat the dignitaries of state like rows of men awaiting their turns in a barber shop. The walls were hung with creditable paintings by native artists. A large oriental rug covered the mahogany floor. On bamboo pedestals around the rooms were miniature wood carvings representing Filipino victims undergoing tortures of various descriptions at the hands of friars and Spanish officials for refusing to divulge the secrets of the Katipunan. One showed a native suspended on tiptoes by a cord tied around his tongue, while a Spanish hireling slashed his back with a knife. Another represented a native of the province of Nueva Ecija, falsely accused of hostility to the Spanish, so I was told. A cord passed through his nose, as if he were a beast of burden. A Spaniard was cudgeling his bare shoulders with a bamboo stick. Another showed a Filipino hung up by his feet with a big stone bound to each shoulder. Still another represented a native with his back bent backwards, a pole passing under his knees, a cord around his chest holding him bent over in a most painful position. And others equally terrible. All these were actual cases. I was told the history of each one. Finally, Aguinaldo was ready to receive us. The red plush curtains that separated his private room from the council chamber were drawn aside by guards, and we entered the Holy of Holies. The little chieftain was already standing to receive us. His spacious room was adorned with Japanese tapestries. Around the walls were handsome Japanese vases, and emblazoned high on one side of the room was a shield of ancient Japanese and Mindanao arms. On another side of the room was a huge Spanish mirror. Back of Aguinaldo's desk hung from its staff a handsome Spanish flag. I jokingly asked Aguinaldo if he would present it to me as a souvenir of my visit. "Not for 25,000 pesos," he replied. "I captured it at Cavite, my native town. The Spaniards have offered thousands of pesos as a bribe for the restoration of that flag, so I keep it here." Aguinaldo is short, his skin is dark, his head is large but well poised on a rather slight body. His hair is the shiny black of the Tagalog, and his combed pompadour, enhancing his height somewhat. On that day he was dressed in a suit of fine piña cloth of native manufacture, and he wore no indication of his rank. Through my Filipino friend as interpreter, I had an extended conversation with him. He told me that he hoped to avoid a rupture with the Americans, but that his people felt that they had been wronged and slighted, and that they were becoming turbulent and difficult to control. He said that his government was thoroughly organized, that throughout the provinces, where insurrection had been incessant for years, all was quiet, and the peaceful pursuits of labor were being carried on. "I hope these conditions will not be disturbed," he added, not without meaning. I asked him if the charges were true that the Spanish friars were maltreated, and if women also were imprisoned. He replied that he was not responsible to anyone for the treatment of his prisoners, but that if an accredited emissary of General Otis would call upon him, he would permit him to visit the places where the Spanish prisoners were confined. As to the women, he said that they were wives of the priests, and voluntarily shared captivity with them. As I left the room, he spoke to my Filipino friend, calling him back. Being somewhat curious at this not altogether polite act, I later asked the reason. My friend smiled and told me that Aguinaldo wished to make a purchase in Manila, and requested him to attend to it. "But what did he want?" I said. My friend again smiled and said, "You know he is vain. He wants me to get him another large mirror like the one in his room. He desires it to be the finest plate glass, and the frame also, Spanish style, to be set with mirrors. He wants, too, some other decorations and knickknacks for his room. He is fond of finery, like the rest of us, you know." I saw that great French plate glass mirror several months later. It was removed from the Aguinaldo sanctum, however, and braced up against a mango tree in front of the palace headquarters. A big, swarthy Kansan was taking his first shave before it after the capture of Malolos, March 31st, 1899. End of section 136. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 137 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Locke of Floyd, Virginia. The World's Story, Volume 1, China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 137, Preparing Our Moros for Government, by R. L. Bullard. A curious and interesting process has been going on in Mindanao. of the Philippines, the West is being grafted upon the East. American government and ways are passing to Oriental savages. The most troublesome and inaccessible tribe were the Lanao Moros, living about the fine lake of that name, high in the mountains and forests of the interior of Mindanao. From thence in the past they had sallied forth when they pleased, in piratical and slave-taking expeditions that made the name of Moro the terror of the Philippines. Returning thither, their ways had seemed to close behind them. It was for the Americans to open these ways, for here, as perhaps over all the earth, road-making was to be the first step, and to merge with government-making and civilization. For the Malanaos, as these Moros called themselves, the two began together. United States troops began laboriously to open a road from the north shores of Mindanao to the borders of Lake Lanao. The work fell to the soldier, for with the coming of civil government to the other Philippines, the Moros, because of their long tradition of piracy, lawlessness, and savagery, had been left to the care of the army. From this work, from his part and charge thereof, and from his subsequent experience as first governor of Lanao, the writer speaks. Having heard only fearful rumors of the military prowess and dire fanaticism of the Moros, we came to find a numerous people in a native state of political chaos, to the civilized mind incomprehensible, for reasonable beings incredible. Nothing, not even pandemonium, could be said to reign in such disorder. An infinity of chiefs, called datos, with pompous titles, sultan and raja, suggesting power and authority, yet having none, divided a fine country into many minute sovereign and independent followings, of uncertain jurisdiction as to persons, places, and things. There were 5 tribes, which, however, differed only in name, not in condition or characteristics. These tribes had their traditional hereditary sultans, doubled and trebled, perhaps, but always largely nominal, and except for their immediate personal following, with but little real authority. Over their sons, the general people, and the countless lesser datos and sultans of the tribe, they had influence, hardly control. The latter governed themselves, that is, lived as they pleased, as they could, or as they were allowed by their neighbors. More probably than any other man on earth, the Moro did as he pleased. His only restraint was his fear of others. With perhaps a dozen separate dato groups within a radius of a mile, with no common superior to adjust differences, followers of different datos wrangled, lay in wait for one another, made war, or watched one another in a state of armed peace that was worse than war. With no other means of squaring accounts than by war and aggression, these were continual. Rivalry and jealousy were the predominant tones. Fear on the dato's part that, if he were severe with his followers, they would leave him, and by joining some neighbors, disturb the local balance of power, prevented the punishment of any but domestic offenses, and so Moros everywhere were thieves, robbers, pirates, and slave-takers, in a state of continual violence and wrongdoing toward one another and all men, so far as they dared. They loved markets, trade, and intercourse, but for these there was no protection except individual prowess. If wives or children went out without guard, but a little way from home, they were likely to be nabbed and run off into slavery by prowling manhunters, shifted about, sold quickly from hand to hand, and lost beyond all power of tracing. They showed signs of industry, but for this virtue savagery offers no encouragement. Trained in the use of the dagger, kreese, two-handed sword, and spear, all Moros were soldiers, proud, quick-tempered, quarrelsome, ever on the lookout for opportunity to try their skill in arms, without which, waking or sleeping, they were never caught. Such were the Moros. There was no government. The only suggestion of it was found in the datto. Manifestly here not only had the foundations of government and order yet to be laid, but the very places for them were to be made and prepared. From a few fights that had preceded our coming, it had been made plain to the American authorities that with our superior intelligence, arms, and organization, we could, whenever desired, absolutely wipe the Moros off the earth. There was, however, in such proceeding neither purpose nor glory, and the policy was to grant opportunity to the Moros, if they would take it, for better things in peace. Thence, logically, my first steps were to try to demonstrate to them our good intentions, to place on exhibition before them the advantages, the benefits of peace, order, and government, things which they had not. Beginning then, the labor of soldiers, slowly and painfully for 4 months, worked a road through jungle, forest, and mountain, toward the heart of the Moro country. In this time, though often invited and always treated with great consideration, but a few straggling Moros came to visit me. With these, however, I spent time patiently, squatting or sitting about camp, sometimes talking, often in silence, all day to the very night, so long as they would stay, to allow them to look and learn, to observe us for themselves, and satisfy their curiosity. Then, as they went away, I invited them to come again to morrow. They came in little bunches, and the dattos talked. They rarely spoke directly upon the subject, which nevertheless I could see was uppermost in their thoughts, our coming. They either disdained any show of interest in it that might imply concern or fear about our presence, for a Moro is nothing if not proud, or else preferred to draw their own conclusions from time and observation. In the outset of trying to establish friendly relations, ill luck befell. Simultaneously with the Americans there appeared amongst the Moros the most fearful of all diseases, the Asiatic cholera, and straightway it was charged upon us. The white men were in league with the cholera man, and had brought his devils to destroy the Moros. My few friends dropped away out of sight, whence they had come. Prowling bands, even lone Moros, beset the trails in camp, lying in wait and attacking with fury and bitterness lone sentinels and small parties. A single old datto, Alandug, stayed. From his seacoast village he had looked wider upon the world, and was wiser than his fellows. I did not need to tell him, for he easily saw for himself our mortal terror of the cholera, whose cause we call germs, he devils. He did not, however, understand why we were not dying like the Moros. I showed him the soldiers boiling their water, and told him that before drinking we thus drove the cholera forth from the water in which it lived. To my surprise, he never flinched at the statement. He swallowed it whole. This truth, so hard of acceptance among wiser men, found ready belief with this savage. Long afterward I knew why. It agreed with the Moro religious theory that all diseases are but devils that have slipped from the outside into the body. Our theory and theirs, so different, yet the same, proved a first bond, something common between white man and brown. Alandug told the other Moros what a just theory the Americans had of the cholera, and how the awful disease had killed but few Americans. In a short time my friends began to come back with him, bringing all the ills of human flesh for cure by advice of the white man, in whose medical theories they had quickly acquired confidence. Thenceforward medicine, and especially quinine, became my ally, esteemed above right, reason, principle, and upon occasions even above force. The labor of building a great road through mountain and tropical forest was slow. We were still, after months, far from the Moro country, not among the people we had come to reach. A weekly market at a coast settlement and the season of salt boiling were, however, bringing parties of Moros from the far interior past us to the coast. Curiosity induced them to squat, talk, and smoke with me, while they "sized up" the Americans and admired their beautiful arms. Thus daily I spent hours with them. The first thing ever in their eyes and thoughts was arms, firearms. But on this subject I would not talk. They were greatly impressed with the quantity and variety of the things we had. Here I was ready for them. The Moros were very poor, they said. They relied upon arms and the religion of the Prophet. Their sultans and dattos were mighty, and were not subject to or ruled over by one another or by any man, because they were brave, feared not death, and their mountains covered them. I told them of the might, but assured them of the friendly intentions of the Americans, that we had not come to fight, but to open roads, so that the Moros could come to buy, sell, trade, work with the Americans, and grow rich; that we had come to bring the Moros all the valuable and useful things which they saw we had. I ended with an offer to hire and pay them for working on the road. Thereat they professed much pleasure. In this my thoughts were on work for peace, theirs on arms for war, firearms, which in the Moro eye shut out sight and consideration of all things else. Moved by the hope of getting these, some smaller dattos near, after much talk, declared themselves ready to accept the offer of work. Old Alandug came first, with a handful of ugly looking followers, whom we treated like kings, and handled like infernal machines ready to go off at any time. When at the end of the day they received their pay, their thoughts turned upon the coin, the money in hand, in a sort of charmed, pleased surprise. The next day saw their numbers grow. Succeeding days new groups were added, with growing confidence, but armed, always armed, stuck all over with daggers and krises. A few days' work, however, and my old friend Alandug fell from me for a while on the arms question. A stray Moro, a low bred common fellow, taking advantage of the datto's absence at work with me, had eloped at one fell swoop with two of the datto's young wives. The datto must have revenge, and to obtain it, rifles from me, his brother, who had come to do the Moros good. Disappointed at my refusal, he went away sulking, but, as I had expected, his people in a day or two sneaked back to work without him, to get from the Americans the sure pay and regular food which made them forget their datto's anger. It was an augury of good which, as time passed, I was to see more and more realized. The market goers and salt makers carried the news of the money getting to the interior, and other strangers appeared, strengthening the number of our laborers and friends, and weakening the ranks of the hesitating or hostile. Pay for work was sure, and the burning desire for arms began to be forgotten in an awakened love of gain. A new force was at work among Moros, and what in civilized men we rail at as low and vile, became in these savages a saving virtue, making for peace and progress. The followers of the datto Alag and the men of Puguan, who, on account of a damsel bought and paid for, but never delivered, had for years been attacking one another on sight, and dared not now, as they loved their lives, meet on market or trail, wipe the score from memory, to come and earn money together on the American road. The Sultan of Balet and the Sultan of Momungan, next door neighbors, who, in a way to rack the nerve and wreck the best men ever built, had long been either at war or in a state of continual guard night and day against each other's raids, forgot the old cannon that had been the cause of the trouble, and came to work on the road without friction. Men to whom it had been discredit, if not dishonor, to be found without arms, gradually came to lay them aside at the white man's insistance, for a short time at least, while they labored. Harder still for a Moro, whose law is an eye for an eye, conduct for conduct to all generations. A datto, a favorite of mine, under the same influence, came after 6 months to look, if not with forgiveness, at least without excitement and feverish desire to kill, upon a Moro road laborer of mine, some of whose people in long gone times had fought and wounded the datto's grandfather. A boyhood spent among simple, ignorant plantation negroes, later experience as officer over them and others like them, the Filipinos, had strongly impressed upon me the distrust which such people always feel toward middlemen of all kinds, especially interpreters. Direct speech alone satisfies them. With the Moros, the constant effort and practice of our all-day séances had in a few months obviated alike the need of interpreter and the possibility of distrust. I had learned their own tongue. They could talk with me directly, and they soon were coming oftener and farther to do it. From the beginning, among these visitors had appeared many panditas, scribes and priests, men of solemn dignity and preoccupied mien. They made a great show of silence, but notwithstanding this, I could see that in reality, by look, gesture, and occasional word, they generally directed the speech of the datto whom they accompanied. They touched so often upon religious matters and customs that I had quickly felt the need of being informed on the subject of Mohammedan teaching, especially concerning conduct and foreign relations. I accordingly primed myself at once, and was soon astonishing the panditas, who were themselves really ignorant of their religion, with my learned talk crammed for the occasion from Sales's translation of the Koran. With the Moros, in Spanish times, religion had been the greatest stumbling block. In their view, the Koran was the whole law, established long ago in the days of the Prophet, so that change and innovation in anything that it governed, and it governed all things, were not only unnecessary, but wrong. Now we, the Americans, had not, like the Spaniards, come talking a new religion. We had the correct Moro theory of disease. Moreover, we had, as it were, slipped up on their weak human side by appealing to their love of gain, and by keeping them employed, had even kept their thoughts from the usual fanatical channels into which they were wont to turn on meeting new things. In short, before the Moros knew it, they had been surprised, juggled out of their usual position, and on this one point of religion, where we had expected the greatest difficulty, we were, on account of a little study and pains, I almost said trick, not only to have none, but were to meet with real assistance in getting control of the bulk of the Moros. Religion is the one thing, if there is any, that faintly holds together the incoherent groups of the race. After many visits from less important priests, came the chief and most reverend one in all Lanao, an old and very shrewd man. I received and treated him with great dignity and show of respect, and talked the Koran with him as long as he pleased. Delighted with his first reception, he came again and often. In a few months he was my stanch friend, and he was sending letters and messages to his people, many of whom were now either preparing for war, or had already been committing acts of war against the Americans. He told them that he spoke the will of Allah Ta'ala, God. It was that they live in peace and accept the Americans. He assured them that the Americans also, like the Moros, knew the will of Allah Ta'ala and the words of the Prophet. With this old man I advised on many subjects, and one of his last acts with me was to rise, to my great surprise, in a grand assembly of his people, a year after our first meeting, and solemnly announce it as the will of God, made known to him that the Americans rule over the Moro people and tax them to the fifth of all their goods. He could have given no greater proof of loyalty, for the rock on which his people split was taxes. For nearly a year the presence of the Americans, contact with them, observation, the example they offered of order, obedience, and government, the practice which in working with the Americans the Moros themselves received in obedience, order, industry, and responsibility, were lessons to the Moros preparatory to government, which was to follow. On many these lessons were unmistakably having the desired effect, on others not. The latter committed against the Americans every aggression that treachery and stealth could devise. Sentinels were stabbed in the dark, lone soldiers ambushed, cut up, and killed, small parties attacked, tents, tools, and arms stolen and carried away. Our patience long left these things unpunished, hoping that with time and a better comprehension of us, the Moros would of themselves see the folly of continuing such acts. On the contrary, as the road went deeper and deeper into the Moro country, these aggressions became worse and more frequent. Our enemies and even our friends began to think we were afraid. Unpunished, enjoying to the full at our expense the gratification of their Moro love of lawlessness, our enemies taunted our friends with a foolish self-denial in abstaining from the sport. The friends felt and protested that we were making no difference between good and bad, between friend and foe. They demanded, and indeed it was right, that a distinction should be made. There was therefore better feeling when one morning all learned that we had surprised in his mountains, captured the arms, destroyed the rendezvous, and scattered the band of Data Matuan, whose followers, as all Moros knew, had beset and robbed the American camps. This was emphasized when, a few days later, after wandering all night through the forest and mountains and wading lakes and marshes, we had captured the fort and had utterly wiped out the band of the Sultan of Berimbingan. His people, under pretense of selling fruit, had treacherously approached, cut up, and disabled for life an American soldier. Jeeringly referring to the Americans' slowness to act against their enemies, he had answered my demand for redress by saying that he would take my message under consideration for some months, and then let me know whether he would talk about the matter at all. But respect grew when the news spread of a score dead in the town of Bacayuan, whose people had killed a soldier for the purpose of robbery, and who, when called upon for justice, had first ignored, and then, fortifying the town, had defied the Americans. Nothing that happened between Americans and Moros was hidden. For the sake of instruction and effect, Moros were made to know or hear all, and in these expeditions the effect was increased in Moro eyes by the fact that the Americans had distinguished well, and no friendly Moro had suffered at their hands. There was in consequence a wider call for American flags as a symbol of friendship. It was enough. Punitive measures were thereupon stopped. They were stopped out of policy also, with a view to the future pacification of even the bad Moros, on the knowledge that with them it is revenge, an eye for an eye, to the end of time, without regard to how justly he who first lost an eye deserved to lose it. For this reason a kill and burn policy can never succeed with Moros, can do nothing more than destroy them. These object lessons had gradually, with the passage of time, brought many villages and settlements to peaceful recognition of the American commander as their common superior. As this process went on, it brought to light the miserable conditions under which these savages had always lived, willing, yet of themselves helpless, to throw them off. I was overwhelmed with a flood of complaints. requests to adjudicate claims, settle disputes and differences between different dattos and villages, punish countless robberies, burnings, murders, and woundings for which there had never in Moro history been any other tribunal than war and counter-aggression. The story led back as far as tradition goes, and opened a broad field of work, too broad for one man. It was plain that here, at least near the road, the preparations for government had outrun the provision of machinery for its operation. However, something had to be done. I therefore quietly assumed the functions of lawmaker, ruler, and judge, ruled and settled disputes and differences on my own judgment and knowledge of conditions. The law was scarcely of record, neither was the old English common law, and the government was somewhat informal. But like all simple folk, Moros seem to prefer personality to form in government. Fortunately, too, with my clients, exact justice according to civilized ideas was not necessary nor in demand. Moros' ideas of justice were, from their history, tradition, and lives, naturally hazy and faint, not to say nil. It was more important here that there be some law than that it be perfect, some decision and end of controversy than that they be just. My dictum was therefore accepted in general by the Moros near. Soon, however, the rumor of these things spreading, acts in intentional contempt and defiance of them as representing the growing American authority began to be committed by remoter dattos. Military men stationed among them need never seek occasions of quarrels with Moros. Moro ignorance, folly, and perversity can be relied upon to furnish plenty of occasions, and such occasions as cannot be ignored or pardoned. Two such were now forced upon me. The Sultan of Detse, amongst the most powerful Moros, under threat of war to the bitter end, was required to make full apology, and to cut off his son from the succession to the sultanate, for public and boastful abuse of the American flag. It was a fit and effective, though severe, punishment. The second was even worse. One morning I surprised and captured, and soon had tried and sentenced to 17 years' imprisonment, two dattos, who, to show their disregard and contempt of what the Americans had enjoined, had made, against Filipinos, a successful slave-taking expedition by sea under the American flag, which they had somehow managed to get hold of. With the Moros, restraint of personal liberty is the most grievous of all things. It is inflicted for no crime, however great, and is allowed for but one cause, insanity. The punishment of the two dattos, therefore, spoke straight to the Moro heart, and all were made to hear it. Death were far preferable. The abused flag came into my hands, along with the dattos. That was the latest, no doubt it will be the last, time that the American flag will cover a slave-taking expedition. The road had now been finished. In its concluding stages, the competition among the Moros for the work, for the opportunity to earn money, had become so sharp as to be troublesome. Dattos were quarreling with one another about it, and, once started at work at a given point, they were so self-willed and determined that they could hardly be stopped to be directed elsewhere. The road work ended, the danger of idleness arose, for it had now become evident to me that Moros could be managed in two ways only: by putting them at work and keeping them at work, or by putting them in fear and keeping them in fear. There is no possibility of living in quiet with unoccupied or uncowed Moros. I preferred the method of work. On my offer to hire them now to fetch supplies from the sea coast, there were repeated all the doubt, hesitation, and delay of the time when they first began work upon the road, complicated this time by fear that the Americans might try to make them carry bacon or something that contained some product of the hog, to the Mohammedan the lowest and vilest of things, accursed by God and the Prophet. After repeated reassurances on this point, they began. At first, to make sure, they would carry only flour, but the work proved profitable and became most popular. Then they took box stuff, then canned stuff, then ceased to question what. every man wisely curbing his curiosity, holding his tongue, carrying all things that came, and Bacon at last among the rest. Assuredly the leaven of new ideas was working. Gradually in the past few months the Moros had accepted much, and this demonstrated their readiness to accept more of what was American. The time seemed opportune to give more form to this beginning of control. Accordingly the writer was duly appointed governor of the Lanao Moros, with a small staff and a scheme of government somewhat like that obtaining over the rest of the Philippines. Its defects were manifest at the very first effort to put it in operation. It failed to turn to account, to place itself at the head of the weak, but only organization in all Moro land, the Dato group, and to lay hold of the only power known to Moros, the authority of the Dato. On a small scale and imperfectly, I had already had a government in operation in the only way that government can for years be operated among the Moros, one-man power, without formality, backed by force and a knowledge of the conditions, and exercised upon the people through their datos. As the law for the new government did not contain these essential provisions, it would not work. But the little machinery of government which had previously been set up went on working quietly, until the new law by amendment adapted itself to the requirements of conditions, and the governor became de jure what he had already long been de facto, father, adviser, judge, sheriff, ruler, lawmaker, with the datos as his subalterns and assistants. Formal acceptance of government was naturally regarded by the Moros as a serious step, even where they had already in effect been living under that same government for some months. Reasons were demanded. I therefore held meetings to explain and satisfy all. Argument was made as varied and as different as the datos themselves. Here came in profitably the knowledge which I had gradually been acquiring of each and every one's circumstances and history. For one, it was sufficient to point out that Americans had not bothered his religion or his women; for another, that he had suffered no injustice from us as he had from other Moros, Filipinos, or Spaniards; for this one, that tribal wars in which his people had almost been wiped out had been stopped by the Americans; for that one, that we had suppressed the thieves who had been robbing him of his women and goods. It was enough to remind the Sultan of Sungud how he and his people had prospered by the Americans, and the Dato of Punud that he was wearing rich clothes since we came. It satisfied some that we had not come and tried to place over them the Filipinos, upon whom the Moros look with contempt as the immemorial source of their slave supply, and with hatred as their traditional enemies; and others, that we had already adjusted and would go on adjusting. It was the purpose of the government to adjust differences and punishing wrongs between the different groups of the Moros, and so wipe out the sudden deadly attacks by one another from which all had suffered, and of which all stood in constant dread before the Americans came among them. "Why do you want this, and what do you come here for, anyhow?" questioned at one of these meetings the old sultan of Bayabao, after I had just finished dealing out quinine to him and his begging retinue one raw rainy day. "We are satisfied as we are," he added vehemently, as he sat shivering in bare feet, thin shirt, and flimsy trousers before me, well warmly and dryly clad. "Have you such shoes and clothes as I, to warm your body and protect your feet? Or have you such medicines as I have just given you, to cure your sickness?" I answered, "Do you know how to make them?" He was silent, and the great crowd listened. "We do, and have come to show you. That is why." To this day he and his people have not fought the Americans, nor resisted their government. It pleased and convinced many when I pointed out and emphasized what they already knew, that now, with a security hitherto unknown to them, they were able to travel through all Lanao. Such were the reasons given, and they were pointed out and patiently repeated as the direct good which had already come, and of which more was to be expected, from the power and authority of the Americans. They won over gradually, without war, half of all the Malanaos, and government went on taking on more form. But the most numerous, warlike, and inaccessible tribe, under the most influential hereditary sultan of all, remained stubbornly hostile and aggressive. In twos and threes his people prowled about, and by cunning stealth and lying in wait, lost no opportunity to rob, assault, stab, kill. They would accept nothing, the Americans said, for while with most men it is credulity, with Moros it seems to be incredulity that goes with the ignorance of the world. To them, accustomed to see men governed only by desires and passions, it was inconceivable that the Americans bore these aggressions from any other cause than fear or weakness. Tradition and experience were all against such an idea. To them, whose largest example of power had been a datto who could muster a few hundred men, it was wholly incredible, and they ridiculed the idea that the United States could bring against them any more men or arms than they had already brought. To them it was inconceivable that any man who would not without more ado destroy his enemy. That the Americans had not done this meant therefore that the Americans could not do it. To talk to them of power without exercising it, or of punishment without executing it, was taken as mere vaporing. To my persuasion, demands, and threats alike, therefore, their dattos sent jeering replies or answered me with worse aggressions. The last straw was the murder of 4 soldiers by stealth to secure their arms. Then followed a deadly punitive expedition. It carried surprise and astonishment, a fearful lesson to foolish, boastful savages, whose ideas of war were 1,000, and of power 3,000 years behind their age. This was the last argument, and to my next invitation not only those who had been punished, but the few others who had stood aloof declared their readiness, and in a short time came under the new government. In organizing them wherever they could be won over and had made full submission, those dattos who had led in hostility were appointed to authority over their people under the United States. For history shows that such men under the conqueror, and whether the conqueror wills it or no, remain the strong spirits and real rulers of their country. Violent changes were thus avoided. All had now come under American authority, and the work of inducing them to accept government was practically finished. There was, however, one thing that still stuck in the throats of all, choking and gagging even those who willingly and peacefully had long been living under the new order. This was the question of taxation, a delicate subject, a last test with Moros, because it is a matter of religion. There had been much talk and murmur of this through all the tribes and groups. Therefore I again held a meeting, at which were assembled all the sultans, dattos, and men of consequence, for question and discussion. I laid before them all the reasons. It appealed to the dattos, who had been appointed to offices over their people, to say that we must have money to pay them, but these were very few. Again, for the common good, I said, to punish criminals and catch thieves. But the common good had little meaning for men who had known no government, no res publica, nothing common. Let every man care for himself was their idea. In all their experience, taxes stood for what had been wrung for selfish purposes by the strong from the weak, by conqueror from conquered, by master from his bondman, and money paid for any other cause than direct barter and sale meant tribute, a horrible thing of subjection, dishonor, and slavery. That good should be alleged of taxation was incomprehensible. That it was intended for the good of those who paid it was past belief. All their experience and tradition were contrary to such a thing. Public spirit could not be appealed to, for a long habit of life in minute communities had effectually throttled the budding of such a feeling, and left only selfishness. Yet I felt no uncertainty as to the ultimate outcome of the matter, for by experience I had learned that in all things whatsoever, to the last, the white man outclasses and can always find some intellectual way to go around a Moro. In this matter it came thus. The Moros, like all other natives of the Philippines, are possessed of a consuming desire to carry a pass, some sort of an official certificate as to character, home, business, and the like of the bearer. and they are willing to pay any amount therefor, and never think of it as taxation. On this weak point the Moros showed the first signs of yielding. Then the plan of indirect taxation caught, pleased, and overcame them, as it catches wiser men than they. Imported cotton cloth paying duty at the custom house had long been reaching the Moros through a few coast traders, and was now in large use among all Moros. Touching the jacket of the nearest datto, "You are a lot of foolish and ignorant children," I said. "You are haggling about paying taxes when you have already been doing it for years, and have actually been giving the Americans money to pay me, to pay the interpreter, and all my soldiers." This at once caught their attention. The explanation followed. They understood it remarkably quickly. They saw the humor and the truth of the thing, and, wondering at the finesse that had been able to make them contribute to their own subjugation, yielded in a sort of nonplussed way, feeling, no doubt, that it was useless to hope to escape a people who could devise such a smart system of getting money from other people without the latter's even knowing it. To my help also at this juncture came my old friend, the priest Naskalim, the metropolitan, as it were, of Lanao, with, if not a revelation, something better, wisdom, to his people. It is the will of Allah Ta'ala, the merciful, who has many names. In these ways government and civilization have gained upon them. End of Section 137. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jim Locke of Floyd, Virginia.
Section 138 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific, read for LibriVox.org by Monica MC. Borobudur, an ancient temple of Java. Photograph, page 562. All that is known of the early history of Java is that before the 11th century the island had made a long advance on the path of civilization. This civilization was derived from the Hindus and was accompanied by the worship of Buddha. A few centuries later came the Hindu Mohammedans as merchants or settlers, and also as missionaries. Later still, Hindu intercourse with Europeans began. This was first carried on by the East India Company of Holland, and the Dutch gradually extended their rule, although from 1811 to 1816 the island was in the hands of the English. At first the Dutch looked upon Java in the familiar fashion of the 18th century in regard to colonies, that is, simply as places from which revenue might be obtained. But since 1870 an effort has been made to govern the land in the interest of the Javanese as well as the Dutch. The Buddhist temple of Borobudur ranks among the architectural wonders of the world. Originally a hill of lava, about 150 feet high, it was hewn by the ancient Hindu builders into 6 mighty terraces, of which the lowest is 600 feet square, surmounted by a host of bell-shaped cupolas and crowded with sculptures. If the statues and bas-reliefs of this temple were placed side by side, they would extend 3 miles. Taken together, they form a gigantic object lesson of the teachings of Buddha. Ascending the terrace, the worshipper passed first through scenes of domestic and outdoor life, men shooting with blowpipes or bows and arrows, musicians playing bagpipes, fishermen with nets and rods, etc. As he ascended, the statues grew more and more religious in character, until at length, having passed through the stages of instruction and left the things of the world far beneath him, he was ready to enter the apex of the temple, and behold with enlightened eyes the image of Buddha, left unfinished as a symbol of the inability of human art to realize or represent perfection. End of section 138. This recording is in the public domain. Section 139 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific, read for LibriVox.org by Monica MC. Detail of temple at Prambanan, photograph, page 562. At Prambanan, not far from Borobudur, There stand in the midst of the tropical jungle the remains of an immense group of Buddhist temples. Although in ruins, these temples fill the beholder with awe, as he considers the amount of labor represented by the elaborate carvings and statues, such as these shown in the illustration, with which every part of the hundreds of buildings in this vast group is covered. End of section 139. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 140 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra. The World Story, Volume 1, China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 140. A Visit to a Head Hunter of Borneo by William Henry Furness III. Borneo is the fifth largest island in the world. Even now only a comparatively small portion of it has been explored, although Portugal, Spain, Holland, and England have all had commercial interests in the country. The northern part is now under an English protectorate. The southern is governed by the Dutch, through the native chiefs. The Editor. Aben Avit sat beside us, and while we were filling our pipes, he produced from the bamboo box, hanging at his side, some tobacco and some of that beautifully dried leaf of the wild banana cut from the heart of the plant before the leaf is unfurled. In unskilled hands it tears like wet tissue paper, but in Aben Avit's a tapering, symmetrical cigarette, 8 inches long, was skilfully rolled on his thigh. A circle of small boys squatted around us, their bright little eyes watching our every movement as intently as we stare at the actions of some strange animal in a zoological garden. If we struck a match, or sneezed, or buttoned our coats, or wiped our faces with a handkerchief, dilated eyes and open mouths attended the action with rapt interest. A few men sat near their chief, and now and then murmured comments to one another in their native tongue, which we did not fully understand, but could guess from the direction of their eyes that we were the subject of their conversation. The evening duties of the household were not, however, interrupted on our account. Men with bundles of dried firewood on their shoulders, women staggering under a load of bamboo joints filled with water and stacked in hampers on their backs, were constantly passing by us, treading heavily, and making the loose boards of the floor clatter and rattle as they plodded their weary way to the apartments. For a time there was almost a constant succession of canoes coming to the landing place, bringing back the workers from the rice clearings, the women all bending under full hampers, some with fresh uncurled fern fronds and the sprouts of a variety of large canna, which they stew with rice to add variety to their diet, some with bundles of the young banana leaf, whereof to make cigarette wrappers, and others with wild tapioca and wild yams. Each one carried her own light paddle in one hand, and a large round and flat sun hat in the other. None of them glanced to right or left, but made her way direct to her family room, and like a ghost faded into the darkness through the small doorway. After them followed the men, dangling their parangs in one hand and trailing their blowpipes and spears in the other. They, too, looked fixedly ahead, until they had hung up their parangs and stuck their spears perpendicularly into a rafter, so that the shaft should be kept straight. This done, they joined the group round the fire, or went down to the river to bathe. At the far end of the house some young fellows were playing mournful tunes on the kaluri, and its organ-like notes were wafted fitfully down to us. Now and then a baby's wail chimed in, and then was quieted by the mother's crooning lullaby. Beneath the house the contented grunting of pigs and the clucking of chickens denoted that these omen-givers had returned from their foraging in the jungle, and had sought the shelter of home for the night. Thus we sat as twilight faded in Aben Avit's veranda. In the home of these people whereof every detail made up their familiar, commonplace life, the only life from cradle to grave that they had ever known or would know, while we by their side were aliens from a world 12,000 miles away, from a country that they had never heard of, and of a race which many of them had never seen before. We were in the very heart of the Bornean jungle, guests in the house of a barbarous, savage, and bloodthirsty head-hunter. But these terms, when applied at that moment to our host, what misnomers! Could contrast be more emphatic than the perfect peacefulness of our surroundings, and the thought that a man as benignant and hospitable as Aben Avit should cherish as his highest aim in life to add every year to that cluster of human heads hanging from the rafters just above us, and gently swaying in the heat ascending from the flames? Is it conceivable that this gentle-hearted man and his circle of good-humoured friends could take pride and pleasure in recognizing and rehearsing the slashes and gashes borne by each head? The long gash there, on the left side of that skull, showing through the piece of old casting-net, was made by Tama Lohong's parang, the very one with carved wooden handle that he carries to this day. The owner of the next skull was fishing when he fell a victim to the stealthy thrust from Apoy's spear. This small one is that of a young girl who tried to escape from the rear of the house when they burned out those madangs, way over near the Rejang river. Thus they can enumerate them all, chief and slave, man, woman, girl and boy. It all seemed so at variance with Aben Avit's genial, courteous hospitality that I wondered if it were possible to look at these skulls through his eyes, and to sympathize with his thrill of pride and exultation in them. I waited until Aben Avit had his cigarette fairly rolled and lit, and then, trying not to appear in the least antagonistic, lest I should fail to elicit his genuine feeling, I asked, "O Sabila, blood brother, why is it that all you people of Kalamantan kill each other and hang up these heads? In the land I come from, such a thing is never known. I fear that it would be ill spoken of there, indeed, perhaps thought quite horrible. What does Aben Avit think of it?" He turned to me in utter, absolute surprise, at first with eyes half closed, as doubting that he heard aright, and, letting the smoke curl slowly out of his mouth for a moment, he then replied, with unwonted vehemence, "No, Tuan, no, the custom is not horrible. It is an ancient custom, a good, beneficent custom, bequeathed to us by our fathers and our fathers' fathers. It brings us blessings, plentiful harvests, and keeps off sickness and pains. Those who were once our enemies hereby become our guardians, our friends, our benefactors." "But," I interrupted, "how does Aben Avit know that these dried heads do all this? Don't you make it an excuse just because you like to shed blood and to kill?" "Ah, Tuan, you white men had no great chief like Tokong to show you what was right. Haven't you ever heard the story of Tokong and his people? He was Raja of the Sibops and the father of all the Kayans, and lived long, long, long ago." I was not acquainted with the story of Tokong, so I begged him to relate it. Then, squatting on the floor with his forearms slightly resting on his knees, and his hands dangling in front of him, he meditatively relit his cigarette, and gazing lovingly up at the cluster of skulls, began. "It was in the old, old days, long before the government came here. By the government I mean our Tuan Raja Brooke. It happened that on a time the descendant of the heaven-born Katira Murai, Tokong, and his men of the Sibop tribe were on an expedition downriver to punish a household of thieves who had stolen their crop of rice the year before, and had chased Tokong's women and children from the jungle clearings. It was the time of year when the fields had just been planted, and before the rice had sprouted. So Tokong took out his warriors to teach these thieves that this year there should be no more stealing. When they had gone down river to the great bamboo clump, where they had to cross through the jungle, they drew their canoes up to the bank, and with Tokong leading, started on their stealthy march. When the eye of day looked straight down at them over their heads, they rested on the bank of a small stream which ran round that great rock. Perhaps, Tuan, you have seen it. We call it Batu Kusieng, near the headwaters of the Belaga and Tinjar rivers. They had cooked and eaten, and drawn out the pegs of wood whereon their rice pots rested, and Raja Tokong was slipping his head through his war coat and girding on his parang, when he heard, coming from under the great rock, a squeaking, croaking voice, uttering "Wonkakok tetabatok." Footnote. Aben Aved did not translate this, and I believe it is ancient Kayan, retained for its onomatopoeic sound. End of footnote. He paused, and turning round to listen to the voice, saw a large frog with its young ones about it, sitting just under the edge of the rock. "Greetings to you, Kop." "Frog," said the Raja. "What is the meaning of your croaking?" And Kop replied, "Alas, what fools you Sibops are! You go out to battle and kill men, but you take back with you to ornament your shields only their hair, whereas, did you but know it, if you took the whole head, you would have blessings beyond words. In sooth, you heavy-livered people know not how to take a head. Look here, and I will show you." This spoke Kop, and straightway seized one of his little ones, and with one stroke of his parang cut off its head. Tokong was exceedingly angry at the impudence and the cruelty of the frog, and paying no further attention to it, ordered his men to advance at once. But some of the older men among them could not help thinking that perhaps Kop spoke the truth, and that night, while they sat round the fire, holding a council of war over the attack on the enemy's house, close at hand, they urged Tokong to allow them to follow the frog's advice. At first Tokong, still very angry because Kop had called the Sibops fools and heavy-livered, refused, but finally, seeing that many of his best men were in favor of it, he granted their request. Next morning, when the sky began to turn grey, and the birds in the trees were just waking up, the Sibops noiselessly carried armfuls of bark and grass, and placed them beneath the thief's house, and set fire to them, and the flames ran quickly everywhere. Out rushed the men and women, some jumping into the flames, others trying to slide down the house posts, but all were met with slashes and stabs from the swords and spears of Tokong's men. Many were killed that day, and the heads of 3 were cut off and carried away by Tokong's party, who retreated at once, and almost before they knew it were at the landing place on the river. To their great amazement, they found their boats all ready and launched. No sooner were they seated than the boats began to move off, of their own accord, right upstream in the direction of home. It was a miracle. The current of the stream changed and ran uphill, as it does at flood tide at the mouth of a river. They almost immediately reached the landing place close to their house, and were overjoyed to see that the crops planted only 15 days before had not only sprouted, but had grown, had ripened, and were almost ready for the harvest. In great astonishment they hurried to the clearings, and up to their house. There they found still greater wonders. Those who were ill when the party set out were now well, the lame walked, and the blind saw. Raja Tokong and all his people were convinced on the spot that it was because they had followed Kop's advice, and they vowed a vow that ever afterward the heads of their enemies should be cut off and hung up in their houses. This is the story of Raja Tokong, Tuan. We all follow his good example. These heads above us have brought me all the blessings I have ever had. I would not have them taken from my home for all the silver in the country. He turned to appeal to his people sitting near, and they, as many as understood Malay, nodded their heads, glancing from him to us, and murmuring, "Betul, betul, 'tis true, 'tis true." He paused to get an ember out of the glowing heap of ashes to light his cigarette again, which had become much crumpled during the narration of Raja Tokong's first head hunt, and after he had it once more in shape, I asked him if he would not regard it as somewhat of an inconvenience if his own head were to be cut off just to bring blessings to an enemy's house. Tuan, he replied, I do not want to become dead any more than I want to move from where I am. If my head were cut off, my second self would go to Bulun Matai, the fields of the dead, where beyond a doubt I should be happy. The Dayongs tell us, and surely they know, that those who have been brave and have taken heads, as I have, will be respected in that other world and will have plenty of riches. When I die, my friends will beat the gongs loud and shout out my name, so that those who are already in Bulun Matai will know that I am coming and meet me when I cross over the stream on Bintang Sikopa, the great log. I shall be glad enough to see them, but I don't want to go today, nor tomorrow. His faith seemed immovable, but I could not resist the temptation of suggesting a doubt, so I asked him, what if the Dayongs were wrong, and there were no Bulun Matai, and that when he stopped breathing he really died and knew no more? He answered me almost with scorn for such a doubt. Tuan, nothing really dies. It changes from one thing to another. The Dayongs must be right, for they have been to the fields of the dead and come back to tell us all about it. Don't you feel sorry, I asked, for those that you kill? It hurts badly to be cut by a parang. You don't like it, and those whom you cut down dislike it as much as you do. They are no more anxious to go to Apolegan or Longjulan, regions of Bulun Matai, than you are. Ha, Tuan, he replied, with the suggestion of a patronizing chuckle in his voice. You feel just as I did when I was a little boy and had never seen blood. But I outgrew such feelings, as everyone should. End of section 140. End of The World's Story, A History of the World in Story, Song and Art. Volume 1, China, Japan and the Islands of the Pacific. Edited by Eva March Tappan.